The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds as two siblings made their way through the busy Atlanta airport. David, 34 years old, walked with the confident stride of someone used to courtrooms and high-pressure situations. As a federal prosecutor, he had spent years fighting for justice, but today he was just a grandson excited to celebrate his grandmother's milestone birthday. Beside him, his younger sister Amelia carried herself with equal poise. At 31, she had already made a name for herself as one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys. Her briefcase contained not legal documents today, but carefully wrapped photo albums and handwritten letters they planned to give their grandmother during the celebration in Los Angeles. "Can you believe Grandma Rose is turning 90? David said as they approached their gate, adjusting his navy blue suit jacket. "It feels like yesterday she was teaching us how to tie our shoes in her kitchen." Amelia smiled, remembering those childhood afternoons. She always said we could be anything we wanted if we worked hard and treated people with respect. Look at us now. Exactly what she hoped we'd become. The siblings had purchased their first-class tickets months ago, wanting to arrive rested for the weekend-long celebration their family had planned. Their grandmother, Rose Thompson, had been a trailblazing educator in the 1960s, one of the first black teachers to integrate the school system in their hometown. The whole family was gathering to honor her incredible life and the path she had opened for future generations. As they waited at gate B12, David pulled out his phone to check messages from his office. A high-profile case was wrapping up next week, but he had cleared his schedule completely for this trip. Nothing was more important than being there for Grandma Rose. "You know she's going to cry when she sees us," Amelia said, watching other passengers begin to line up for boarding. "Remember last Christmas when we surprised her? She couldn't stop hugging us for 20 minutes. The woman raised 8 kids, while working 2 jobs and still found time to volunteer at the community center every weekend," David replied. "If anyone deserves to get emotional at their birthday party, it's her." Flight 447 began boarding right on schedule. The gate agent, a friendly woman in her 50s, checked their boarding passes with a warm smile. "First class, lucky you. Have a wonderful flight." As they walked down the jet bridge, both siblings felt that familiar excitement that comes with traveling somewhere special. They had made this trip to Los Angeles many times over the years, but this one felt different. This was about celebrating someone who had shaped not just their lives, but their entire family's legacy. The airplane was one of those newer models with spacious first-class cabins. David and Amelia found their seats, 2A and 2B, right behind the bulkhead. The leather seats were comfortable and they had plenty of room to stretch out during the 5-hour flight. "I still can't believe she insisted on cooking for everyone this weekend," Amelia said as she stored her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. 90 years old, and she's worried about whether there will be enough food. "That's Grandma Rose for you," David laughed. "Remember when she made Thanksgiving dinner for 35 people when she was 85? Wouldn't let anyone help with anything except setting the table." Other first-class passengers were settling in around them. There was a businessman in his 60s reading financial reports, a young couple who looked like they might be on their honeymoon, and an elderly woman traveling with what appeared to be her adult daughter. Everyone seemed relaxed and friendly as they prepared for departure. David pulled out a small wrapped package from his briefcase. "I keep looking at this and wondering if she'll like it," he said, showing it to his sister. "She's going to love it," Amelia assured him. "You spent 3 months tracking down that original copy of her favorite book from when she was teaching. It's perfect." The gift was a first edition of a poetry collection their grandmother had used in her English classes for decades. David had contacted rare book dealers across the country to find it, wanting to give her something that represented her passion for education and literature. "What about your surprise?" he asked. "You've been so secretive about it." Amelia grinned. "Let's just say I found some old footage from her retirement ceremony in 1995. The whole school district honored her, and somehow nobody in the family has a copy. I had it digitized and put together a little video presentation." The plane was filling up now, and the flight crew was making their final preparations. Most of the flight attendants seemed professional and courteous, greeting passengers and helping with luggage. But David noticed one crew member who caught his attention for all the wrong reasons. She was a woman in her late 40s with blonde hair pulled back tightly, and from the moment she appeared in the first-class cabin, something about her demeanor seemed off. While her colleagues smiled and made small talk with passengers, she moved through the aisle with what looked like barely concealed irritation. Her name tag read Sandra, and she was checking overhead bins with an almost aggressive efficiency. When she passed David and Amelia's row, she paused for just a moment, looking at them with an expression that made both siblings uncomfortable. "Is everything all right?" Amelia asked politely, thinking perhaps there was some issue with their seating. Sandra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at their boarding passes, which were clearly visible on the small table between their seats, then looked back at them with what could only be described as suspicion. "Fine," she said curtly, before moving on to the next row, where she immediately brightened when greeting the elderly woman and her daughter. David and Amelia exchanged glances. Both of them had experienced enough prejudice in their lives to recognize the signs, but they hoped they were wrong. Maybe Sandra was just having a bad day. Maybe they were reading too much into a brief interaction. "Let's not worry about it," David said quietly. "We're here to celebrate Grandma Rose, not deal with other people's problems." Amelia nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. In her work as a civil rights attorney, she had developed an almost sixth sense for discrimination. The way Sandra had looked at them, the tone of her voice, the contrast in how she treated other passengers, it all felt familiar in the worst possible way. As the plane prepared for takeoff, both siblings tried to focus on the positive. They talked about their grandmother's stories, the relatives they'd see at the party, and the memories they hoped to create during their visit. But in the back of their minds, they both wondered if this flight was going to be more challenging than they had anticipated. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing their expected flight time to Los Angeles. David looked out the window as the plane pulled back from the gate, thinking about how proud their grandmother would be to see them now, successful, accomplished, and on their way to honor the woman who had made it all possible. Neither of them could have imagined what the next few hours would bring, or how one person's prejudice would turn their celebration trip into something much more significant. But for now, they were just two siblings heading to a family party, carrying gifts and memories, ready to show their love for the woman who had taught them that dignity and respect should never be compromised, no matter what challenges life might bring. 20 minutes into the flight, David was reviewing some documents on his tablet while Amelia flipped through a magazine. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and most passengers were settling in for the long journey to Los Angeles. The gentle hum of the engines created a peaceful atmosphere, and both siblings were starting to relax after the busy morning at the airport. That's when Sandra appeared at their row again. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice sharp and demanding. "I need to see your boarding passes." David looked up from his tablet, confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your boarding passes, I need to check them again." Amelia set down her magazine and gave Sandra a polite smile. "We already showed them when we boarded. Is there some kind of problem?" Sandra's eyes narrowed. "There might be. Just show me your boarding passes." David reached for the boarding passes they had tucked into the seat pocket. He handed them over, trying to keep his voice calm and professional. "Here they are. Is everything okay?" Sandra examined the passes, with exaggerated care, holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. She looked back and forth between the passes and the siblings several times, taking much longer than necessary. "These seats are 2A and 2B, she finally said. "Yes, that's correct," Amelia replied. "Those are our assigned seats. And you paid for first class?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Both David and Amelia felt their stomachs tighten. They had heard that tone before, the implied accusation, the assumption that they didn't belong where they were. "Yes, we purchased these tickets 3 months ago," David said, keeping his voice steady. "Is there some issue with our reservation?" Sandra didn't answer directly. Instead, she continued staring at them with obvious suspicion. "I just need to make sure everything is legitimate." The word hit both siblings like a slap. Around them, other first-class passengers were starting to notice the commotion. The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. The young couple stopped their conversation. The elderly woman and her daughter turned to look. "Ma'am," Amelia said, her attorney training kicking in, "we've shown you our boarding passes twice now. Our tickets are valid and we're in our assigned seats. What exactly is the problem?" That's when Sandra's professionalism completely disappeared. "The problem," she said, raising her voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "is that you two have been disruptive since the moment you got on this plane." David blinked in disbelief. "Disruptive? We've been sitting here quietly reading." "Don't lie to me," Sandra snapped. "I've been watching you, making noise, bothering other passengers." Both siblings looked around the cabin. No one was nodding in agreement. In fact, several passengers looked confused and uncomfortable, clearly wondering what Sandra was talking about. "We haven't made any noise," Amelia said firmly. "We've barely spoken since takeoff." "And now you're arguing with me," Sandra continued, her voice getting louder. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. People like you think you can just act however you want up here." The phrase "people like you" sent a chill through both siblings. There was no mistaking what Sandra meant. David felt his jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain calm. Years of courtroom experience had taught him how to handle hostile situations. "Ma'am, I think there's been some misunderstanding. We're just traveling to Los Angeles for our grandmother's birthday party." "I don't care why you're traveling," Sandra shot back. "What I care about is maintaining order on this aircraft. And right now you two are disturbing that order." "By sitting quietly in our paid seats?" Amelia asked, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to stay composed. Sandra leaned down, bringing her face closer to theirs. "Don't get smart with me. I have the authority to have you removed from this plane if necessary." The threat was clear, and it sent a ripple of shock through the nearby passengers. The businessman across the aisle actually put down his newspaper completely and leaned forward, clearly disturbed by what he was witnessing. "Removed for what?" David asked. "What exactly are you accusing us of?" "Disrupting the flight, refusing to follow crew instructions. Take your pick." "What instructions?" Amelia demanded. "You asked for our boarding passes and we gave them to you. What other instructions have you given us?" Sandra straightened up, realizing she was backed into a corner by her own illogical accusations. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Your attitude right now is proving my point," she said. "This kind of behavior doesn't belong in first class." The implication was crystal clear to everyone listening. Sandra wasn't talking about their behavior. She was talking about them, about who they were, about what they looked like. David felt a familiar anger building in his chest. The same anger he'd felt as a child when teachers assumed he wasn't smart enough for advanced classes. The same anger he'd felt in law school when classmates questioned whether he'd earned his spot. But he also felt something else. The voice of his grandmother rose, reminding him that dignity was more important than anger. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm a federal prosecutor. My sister is a civil rights attorney. We're educated professionals, traveling to celebrate our grandmother's 90th birthday. We have done nothing wrong, nothing disruptive, and nothing that warrants this treatment." For a moment, Sandra seemed taken aback by this information. But instead of apologizing or reconsidering her behavior, she became even more aggressive. "I don't care what you claim to be," she said. "Anyone can say they're a lawyer or a prosecutor. What I see are two passengers who think they're better than everyone else and don't want to follow the rules." "What rules?" Amelia asked, her professional training taking over. "Please tell me specifically which rule we've broken." Sandra's face flushed red. She clearly hadn't expected to be challenged so directly, especially not by someone who knew how to ask the right questions. "The rule about respecting flight crew," she said weakly. "We've been nothing but respectful," David replied. "We answered your questions, provided our boarding passes when asked, and remained calm despite being treated unfairly." "Unfairly?" Sandra's voice cracked with indignation. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to harass passengers who haven't done anything wrong?" Amelia asked. By now, the entire first-class cabin was watching the confrontation. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, others looked angry on behalf of the siblings, and a few were whispering among themselves about what they were witnessing. Sandra seemed to realize she had an audience, which only made her more defensive. "I'm maintaining safety and order on this aircraft," she announced loudly. "And if certain passengers can't handle that, maybe they should have flown coach." The comment was so blatantly inappropriate that several passengers audibly gasped. The young couple looked shocked. The elderly woman shook her head in disgust. Even the businessman was shaking his head. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "I think I need to document this interaction," he said calmly. "Put that away," Sandra snapped. "You can't record on the airplane." "Actually," Amelia said, her legal expertise showing, "passengers are allowed to record interactions with crew members as long as it doesn't interfere with safety procedures. This is a well-established right." Sandra's face grew even redder. She was clearly out of her depth, having expected the siblings to back down in the face of her authority. Instead, she found herself dealing with two people who knew their rights and weren't afraid to stand up for themselves. "I'm warning you," she said, pointing at David's phone. "Put that away, or I'll have you arrested when we land." "For exercising our legal rights?" David asked, continuing to record. The situation had escalated far beyond anything the siblings had expected when they boarded the plane that morning. What should have been a peaceful flight to celebrate their grandmother's birthday had turned into a public confrontation with someone who clearly had issues with their presence in first class. But neither David nor Amelia was willing to back down. Their grandmother had taught them too well about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. Sandra stepped back for a moment, clearly frustrated that her intimidation tactics weren't working. The siblings remained calm, but both were recording the interaction now. David held his phone steady while Amelia used hers to capture a wider angle of what was happening. "Ma'am, we're just trying to get to Los Angeles peacefully," David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to speaking in courtrooms. "We've done nothing wrong, and we'd appreciate being left alone to enjoy our flight." But Sandra wasn't ready to back down. If anything, the presence of the phones seemed to make her more agitated. She looked around the cabin, seeming to search for support from other passengers, but found only uncomfortable stares and disapproving faces. "You think you're so smart with your phones," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Recording everything like you're some kind of victims." "We're recording because we want an accurate record of this interaction," Amelia replied professionally. "That's our right as passengers." Sandra's next move shocked everyone in the cabin. She leaned down and sniffed near David's seat, then straightened up with a look of exaggerated disgust. "I can smell alcohol on you," she announced loudly. "You're intoxicated." The accusation was so ridiculous that several passengers actually laughed out loud. David hadn't had a drink in 3 days, having been preparing for an important case. He rarely drank anyway, maybe a glass of wine with dinner on special occasions. "That's completely false," David said, his voice steady but firm. "I haven't had any alcohol today, yesterday, or the day before that." "Don't lie to me," Sandra shot back. "I can smell it from here. Drunk passengers are not allowed in first class." The businessman across the aisle finally spoke up. "Excuse me, miss," he said to Sandra. "I've been sitting right here the whole time, and these folks haven't been drinking anything. They haven't even ordered a beverage yet." Sandra whirled on him. "Sir, please mind your own business. This is a crew matter." "When you're making false accusations loudly enough for the whole cabin to hear, it becomes everyone's business," the man replied firmly. The elderly woman traveling with her daughter also chimed in. "I've been watching too, and these young people have been nothing but polite." "You're the one causing a disturbance." Sandra's face turned an even deeper shade of red. She was clearly not used to passengers standing up to her, let alone defending each other. "Everyone needs to stay out of this," she snapped. "I'm handling a security situation." "What security situation?" Amelia asked. "Please explain exactly. What security threat we pose by sitting in our assigned seats?" Instead of answering, Sandra made another shocking accusation. She pointed at the seat pocket in front of Amelia. "You've been stealing items from the seat pocket," she declared. "I saw you take things that don't belong to you." Amelia looked down at the seat pocket, which contained only the standard airline magazine, safety card, and air sickness bag. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been taken. "Ma'am, there's nothing missing from this seat pocket," Amelia said, pulling out the contents to show everyone. "Everything that's supposed to be here is still here." "I saw you put something in your purse," Sandra insisted. "What did I supposedly take?" Amelia asked, opening her purse to show its contents. "Here's my wallet, my phone charger, some mints, and my grandmother's birthday card. What exactly am I supposed to have stolen?" Sandra couldn't answer because there was nothing to answer. Her accusations were getting more desperate and more obviously false with each passing minute. David looked at his sister and made a decision. "I think I need to call my supervisor at the Department of Justice," he said. "This situation needs to be documented properly." He started to dial a number on his phone, but Sandra immediately lunged forward. "You cannot make phone calls during flight," she shouted. "That's a federal aviation regulation." "Actually," Amelia said calmly, "passengers are allowed to use phones when the aircraft is at cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign is off," which it is. Sandra tried to grab David's phone right out of his hand. "Give me that phone." David pulled back, protecting his device. "Ma'am, you cannot take a passenger's personal property. That would be theft." "I'm confiscating it for safety reasons," Sandra declared. "What safety reasons?" David asked. "The phone is in airplane mode, we're at cruising altitude, and you have no legal authority to confiscate personal property without cause." The situation was spiraling completely out of control. Other passengers were now openly discussing what they were witnessing. The young couple was whispering frantically to each other. The businessman was shaking his head in disgust. Even passengers from coach were craning their necks to see what all the commotion was about. Sandra seemed to realize she was losing control of the situation, which only made her more desperate. She pressed the call button for the other flight attendants, and within moments 2 of her colleagues appeared. "What's going on here?" asked a male flight attendant named Robert. "These passengers are being disruptive and intoxicated," Sandra announced. "They're refusing to follow crew instructions and they're recording without permission." Robert looked at David and Amelia, who were sitting calmly in their seats with their phones visible but not pointed aggressively. He looked around at the other passengers, all of whom seemed to be staring at Sandra rather than the siblings. "What instructions did you give them?" Robert asked Sandra. I told them to stop being disruptive." "How are they being disruptive?" Sandra faltered. "They were making noise and bothering other passengers." Robert looked at the businessman across the aisle. "Sir, were these passengers bothering you?" "Not at all," the man replied immediately. "They've been quiet and polite the entire time. The only disturbance has been from her," he said, pointing at Sandra. The elderly woman nodded vigorously. "That's right. These young people haven't done anything wrong." Robert was clearly trying to understand the situation, but it was becoming obvious that Sandra's version of events didn't match what anyone else had witnessed. "And you said they're intoxicated?" Robert asked. "I smelled alcohol," Sandra insisted. "I haven't had any alcohol," David said calmly. "I'd be happy to take a breathalyzer test if one is available." Robert looked uncomfortable. As a senior flight attendant with 15 years of experience, he had dealt with plenty of actual disruptive passengers. These two didn't fit the profile at all. "Sandra," he said quietly, "maybe we should discuss this privately." But Sandra wasn't ready to back down. If anything, having her colleagues there seemed to embolden her. "No," she said loudly. "These passengers think they can do whatever they want because they're in first class. Well, I have news for them. First class doesn't mean you're above the rules." "What rules have we broken?" Amelia asked again. "Please be specific." Sandra's response was to make her most outrageous threat yet. "If you don't stop this behavior right now," she announced, "I'm going to have federal air marshals arrest you the moment we land in Los Angeles." The threat hung in the air like a bomb. Federal air marshals. Arrest. For what? Sitting in their assigned seats? Asking reasonable questions? Recording an interaction with a crew member? David felt something shift inside him. This had gone far, beyond simple harassment or even discrimination. This was someone with authority making threats that could seriously impact their lives and careers. False arrest charges could destroy his reputation as a prosecutor. They could damage Amelia's law practice. Most importantly, they would miss their grandmother's birthday celebration. The whole reason they were on this plane in the first place. That's when Amelia made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a name that made her smile slightly despite the situation. Judge Patricia Hawkins had been her grandmother's student teacher back in 1965, one of the first young white teachers to work under Rose Thompson when the schools were being integrated. Over the decades, Patricia had become like family, rising through the legal system to become one of the most respected federal judges in the country. Judge Patricia was also someone who didn't tolerate injustice in any form. "Excuse me, Amelia," said politely to Sandra. "I need to make one phone call." "Absolutely not," Sandra shouted. "No phone calls." But Amelia was already dialing. Amelia held her phone steady as it rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. "Judge Patricia Hawkins speaking." "Judge Patricia, it's Amelia Thompson, Rose Thompson's granddaughter." There was immediate warmth in the judge's voice. "Amelia, how wonderful to hear from you. Aren't you supposed to be flying to your grandmother's birthday party today?" "That's actually why I'm calling," Amelia said, speaking quietly but clearly. "David and I are on the plane right now, and we're having a serious problem with discrimination from a flight attendant." Sandra was standing right there, listening to every word, but she couldn't hear the other side of the conversation. Her face showed confusion mixed with growing concern as she realized this wasn't just any phone call. Judge Patricia's tone immediately shifted to serious. "Tell me what's happening. We're being harassed, accused of being drunk when we haven't had any alcohol, accused of stealing items that are clearly still in the seat pocket, and now we're being threatened with arrest by federal air marshals when we land, all because we're sitting in our paid first-class seats. Are you recording this?" "Yes, ma'am. We have video of everything." "Good. Keep recording." "What airline and flight number?" Amelia provided the details while Sandra stood there looking increasingly uncomfortable. The other flight attendants were exchanging worried glances, clearly realizing this situation was bigger than they had thought. "Amelia," Judge Patricia said, "I want you to stay calm and keep documenting everything. Don't let them provoke you into any reaction they could use against you. I'm making some calls right now." "Thank you, Judge Patricia. We just want to get to Grandma Rose's party." "You will. I promise you that." Amelia ended the call and looked up at Sandra, who was now visibly nervous. "Who was that?" Sandra demanded. "A family friend," Amelia replied calmly. "You can't just call people and make up stories about the crew," Sandra said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had before. "I didn't make up anything," Amelia said. "I told her exactly what happened, just like our recording shows." Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in her chambers in Washington, D.C., Judge Patricia Hawkins was already dialing her first number. As one of the most respected federal judges in the country, she had connections everywhere, and she wasn't afraid to use them when justice was at stake. Her first call was to the airline's corporate headquarters. "This is Judge Patricia Hawkins. I need to speak with your CEO immediately about a civil rights violation happening right now on Flight 447 from Atlanta to Los Angeles." The corporate operator, recognizing the name of a federal judge, immediately transferred the call to the executive floor. Within 5 minutes, Judge Patricia was speaking directly with the airline's chief executive officer, explaining the situation and making it clear that this wasn't just about customer service. This was about two prominent legal professionals being discriminated against at 30,000 feet. The CEO, realizing the potential legal and public relations disaster unfolding on his airline, immediately called the Flight Operations Center. Back on the plane, Sandra was still trying to maintain control of the situation, but cracks were showing in her confidence. The other flight attendants were asking her quiet questions, trying to understand what had really happened. Robert, the senior flight attendant, pulled Sandra aside. "Sandra, I've been doing this for 15 years. These passengers don't seem disruptive to me. Are you sure about all these accusations?" "Of course I'm sure," Sandra snapped, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. "The other passengers are saying you're the one causing problems. Maybe we should just let this go and get through the rest of the flight peacefully. No way, Sandra said. They think they're better than everyone else. They need to learn that actions have consequences, but consequences were already starting to unfold in ways Sandra never expected. Judge Patricia's second call was to her contact at the Federal Aviation Administration. As a federal judge who had worked on several cases involving airline regulations, she knew exactly who to call to get immediate attention. This is Judge Hawkins. I need you to contact the crew of Flight 447 immediately. There's a serious civil rights violation in progress, and I need the captain to know that federal authorities are now monitoring this situation. Her third call was to a friend who worked as a legal correspondent for a major news network. Judge Patricia had always believed that sunlight was the best disinfectant for discrimination. Patricia, you know I always take your calls seriously, the correspondent said. What's happening? Two accomplished attorneys, both African American, are being harassed and threatened with arrest on a commercial flight for no reason other than the color of their skin. I have their contact information and they're recording everything. This is happening right now? Right now. Flight 447, Atlanta to Los Angeles. We'll have crews standing by at LAX. Back on the plane, David noticed that Sandra kept glancing toward the front of the aircraft, as if she was expecting something. Her confidence from earlier was clearly shaking. The captain's voice came over the intercom, which wasn't unusual during a long flight. But what he said next was definitely unusual. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received some communications from ground control that require our immediate attention. We're going to need to return to Atlanta as soon as possible. Flight attendants, please prepare for an unscheduled landing. A murmur of confusion went through the cabin. Passengers started asking each other what could be wrong. Was there a mechanical problem? A medical emergency? Sandra's face went white. She clearly hadn't expected this. Why are we turning around? The businessman across the aisle asked. Robert, the senior flight attendant, looked just as confused as everyone else. I'm not sure, sir. The captain will make another announcement when he has more information. But David and Amelia had a pretty good idea why they were returning to Atlanta. Judge Patricia's phone call had clearly set something in motion. Sandra tried one last desperate move. She approached the siblings again, but this time her tone was completely different. Look, she said quietly, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. If you just delete those recordings, we can forget this whole thing happened. Delete the recordings? David asked. Why would we do that? Because maybe I was having a bad day. Maybe I overreacted a little. A little? Amelia asked. You accused us of being drunk, accused us of stealing, and threatened to have us arrested. That's not overreacting a little. That's serious misconduct. Sandra looked around nervously. Other passengers were still watching, and she seemed to realize, for the first time, how many witnesses there were to her behavior. I could lose my job over this, she said quietly. You should have thought about that before you decided to harass us, David replied, but his tone wasn't cruel. As a prosecutor, he had seen enough people destroy their own lives with bad choices to feel some sympathy, even for someone who had treated him terribly. The plane was definitely turning now. Passengers could feel the change in direction, and the captain came back on the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are returning to Atlanta due to an operational issue that needs to be resolved on the ground. We apologize for any inconvenience and we'll have more information for you shortly. Sandra was now visibly sweating. She kept looking toward the cockpit, then back at David and Amelia, as if trying to figure out if there was any way to undo what had happened. But it was too late. The wheels Judge Patricia had set in motion were already turning, and they were much bigger than anything Sandra could stop. The elderly woman traveling with her daughter leaned across the aisle. I hope you young people get justice, she said, kindly. What she did to you was wrong and everyone here saw it. Other passengers were nodding in agreement. The businessman was already typing notes on his phone, apparently documenting what he had witnessed. The young couple was discussing how they could help if needed. In less than an hour, what had started as Sandra's attempt to intimidate two passengers had turned into a federal case with a judge, airline executives, government officials, and news. crews all getting involved, and they were heading back to Atlanta where all of those consequences would be waiting on the ground. As Flight 447 descended back toward Atlanta, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. Sandra had retreated to the galley area, clearly trying to avoid further interaction with David and Amelia. The other flight attendants were huddled, together, whispering urgently as they tried to understand what was happening. The captain's voice came over the intercom one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing at Atlanta in approximately 15 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. There will be some additional procedures once we're on the ground, and we appreciate your patience. Quidam." Looked out the window as the familiar skyline of Atlanta came into view. Just a few hours ago, they had been excited about taking off from this same airport, heading to celebrate their grandmother's birthday. Now they were coming back under circumstances they never could have imagined. "You know what's funny?" Amelia said quietly to her brother. "Grandma Rose always told us that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. She's going to be so proud when we tell her this story," David replied. 90 years old and she's still teaching us lessons. As the plane touched down, passengers could see that this wasn't a normal landing. Through the windows, they could spot several official vehicles near the gate, airport security, airline management, and what looked like news vans already positioned nearby. The plane came to a stop, but instead of the usual announcement about deplaning, the captain asked everyone to remain seated. Within minutes, several people in business suits boarded the aircraft and headed straight for the first-class cabin. The first person to approach was a woman in her 50s wearing a crisp navy suit. She walked directly to David and Amelia's row. "Mr. Thompson? Ms. Thompson? I'm Jennifer Chen, Vice President of Customer Relations for the airline. I want to personally apologize for what you've experienced today." Behind her was a man who introduced himself as the airline's Chief Operating Officer, followed by the airport's Head of Security and a representative from the Department of Transportation. Sandra, who had been hiding in the galley, was escorted off the plane by airport security. As she passed the siblings' row, she wouldn't make eye contact. Her airline career was over, and everyone knew it. "We've reviewed the preliminary reports and spoken with several witnesses," Ms. Chen continued. "What happened today is completely unacceptable and goes against everything our airline stands for." The businessman across the aisle raised his hand. "Excuse me, but I witnessed the entire thing. These two passengers did absolutely nothing wrong. That flight attendant was completely out of line from the beginning." The elderly woman nodded vigorously. "I've been flying for 40 years and I've never seen anything like it. Those young people were perfect passengers." Ms. Chen thanked the witnesses and turned back to David and Amelia. "We'd like to offer you our most sincere apologies and discuss how we can make this right." "What we want," Amelia said firmly, "is to make sure this never happens to anyone else." "Absolutely," the COO said. "We're implementing immediate changes to our training programs and our policies for handling passenger complaints." David checked his phone and saw several missed calls from his office, along with text messages asking if he was okay. News of the incident was already spreading through legal circles. "We do appreciate your apologies," David said. "But right now, we just want to get to Los Angeles for our grandmother's birthday party. We've already missed most of the day." "Of course," Ms. Chen said immediately. "We have a private jet standing by to take you to Los Angeles. You'll be there in time for dinner." The offer was generous, but both siblings were exhausted from the ordeal. The stress of being falsely accused, threatened, and humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers had taken its toll. "Actually," Amelia said, "I think we'd prefer to drive. We need some time to process what happened." The airline executives looked disappointed, but understanding. "We completely respect that decision. We'll arrange for a rental car and cover all your expenses, including hotel accommodations, if you decide to stay overnight anywhere along the way." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the plane, something unexpected happened. The other first-class passengers started applauding. Then the applause spread to the rest of the cabin as word of what had really happened made its way through the plane. The businessman stood up and shook both of their hands. "You handled that with more grace than I would have," he said. "Your grandmother raised you right. The elderly woman gave them both hugs. You made that woman face consequences for her actions. That took courage. Even passengers from coach were stopping to express their support as David and Amelia made their way off the plane. It was overwhelming and touching at the same time. Outside, the gate, they were met by airport officials and, surprisingly, Judge Patricia Hawkins herself. She had flown down from Washington as soon as she heard what was happening. "Judge Patricia," Amelia said, rushing to hug the woman who had been like family for decades. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Of course I did," Judge Patricia said. "Rose Thompson's grandchildren were being treated unjustly. There was nowhere else I'd rather be." Judge Patricia had already been briefed on everything that had happened. She walked with them through the airport, past the news crews who were respectfully keeping their distance, to a quiet area where they could talk. "I'm proud of how you handled this," she said. "You stayed calm, documented everything and used the system the right way. Your grandmother taught you well. We learned from the best," David said. "Grandma Rose always said that dignity can't be taken away. It can only be given up. And you never gave it up." Judge Patricia agreed. By the time they reached the rental car area, the airline had already arranged for a luxury SUV for their drive to Los Angeles. They also provided a complete travel package for their return trip, along with a substantial settlement that they initially tried to refuse. "Take it," Judge Patricia advised. "Not for yourselves, but so you can do something positive with it." As they drove out of Atlanta that evening, both siblings were quiet for the first few miles. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Amelia finally said. "What's that?" "That flight attendant probably thought we were just regular passengers who would be too scared or embarrassed to fight back. She had no idea who she was messing with." David smiled. "Judge Patricia always says that discrimination only thrives in darkness. The moment we turned on those phone cameras and made that call, we brought light to the situation." They drove through the night, taking turns at the wheel and talking about their grandmother, their careers, and what they wanted to do with the settlement money. By the time they reached Los Angeles the next morning, they had a plan. Grandma Rose was waiting for them at their cousin's house, where the birthday celebration had been moved to accommodate their late arrival. When they walked through the door, she took one look at their faces and knew something significant had happened. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into her favorite chair. As they recounted the story, their grandmother's expression went through a range of emotions. Anger at the injustice, pride in how they handled it, and satisfaction at the outcome. "You know," she said when they finished, "this reminds me of something that happened to me in 1963, when I was one of the first black teachers in the integrated schools. A parent complained that I wasn't qualified to teach her child. The principal could have quietly transferred me to avoid conflict." "What happened?" David asked. "Instead, he called a meeting with all the parents and had me present my credentials, my lesson plans, and my teaching philosophy. By the end of that meeting, that same parent was asking if her child could be moved to my class." She smiled at her grandchildren. "Sometimes the best response to prejudice is simply to show people who you really are, and that's exactly what you did on that plane." 6 months later, David and Amelia used their settlement money to establish the Rose Thompson Foundation for Travel Equality, providing legal assistance to travelers who face discrimination. The airline implemented comprehensive bias training for all employees and created new policies for handling passenger complaints. Sandra never worked in aviation again, but the incident became a case study in business schools about the importance of treating all customers with respect and dignity. And every year on Grandma Rose's birthday, the family tells the story of how her grandchildren turned a moment of hatred into an opportunity for positive change, just like she had taught them. The flight that was supposed to take them to a celebration ended up becoming a celebration itself, a celebration of justice, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right.